So let's talk about the RDL and some of the common mistakes that you're probably making. So the first mistake I tend to see on people doing the RDLs is they tend to go too low. The whole point of the RDL is to maximize the stretch on the glutes when you're at the bottom. So what I recommend is film yourself first, see at what point your glutes stop moving backwards, because we want to get to the point where your glutes stop moving backwards, and that's your bottom position, and then you essentially drive your way back up again. Going any lower, all that's going to do is going to put pressure on your lower back. It's going to make your lower back hurt, and you're not going to be able to progress as effectively and as optimally as you probably could. So the other point I tend to see is people tend to not engage the lats. What that allows you to do is it allows you to stack your back a lot more, make sure you're a lot more compact, make sure you're nicely braced, and that allows you to shift a lot more weight. That will take the pressure off your lower back because you're going to be nice and rigid and solid as you're doing it. So what I try and do is I try and keep my hands in front of me, so just to give you as a demo here, and then what I try and do is I try and bend the bar as if I'm trying to break it. That way I'm engaging my lats, and that way my whole body is stacked. So that to me tends to be a big mistake that I see people make, is they just don't think about their upper body enough when they're doing heavy RDLs. The next mistake I tend to see is people bending their knees at the bottom, and effectively it just turns into a bit of a deadlift. So when you're going past your knees on your way down, try and keep your shin angle vertical. So your shins are supposed to stay upright, and all you're trying to do is stick your bum back as far as you can. When you start bending your knees, all that happens is it takes tension away from your hamstrings. So your hamstrings aren't working as effectively as they could. Yes, you can bend your knees slightly if you're trying to target your glutes a little bit more, but you want to avoid excessive bending to the point where you are essentially getting into a deadlift position. So make sure you keep your shins vertical, and one cue that I tend to have is I try and focus on driving my hips into the sky when I'm at the bottom. So that helps me then lock my knees out a little bit more and put more tension on my hamstrings and my glutes. Elevating your toes when doing an RDL does absolutely nothing, because if you think about your foot, elevating that, put tension on your calf, it won't necessarily add any stretch to your hamstring, and probably what you are feeling is your sciatic nerve rather than anything extra on your hamstrings. Just because you are feeling it more in your hamstrings does not mean you are working them more. Stand in a normal position, flat on the floor, and then just perform the RDL as normal, rather than sort of trying to add an extra sensation that kind of is unnecessary. And the final point I wanted to make is, and this is something that I tell my clients a lot, it's not an up and down movement. As much as the bar is traveling up and down, it is a backwards forwards movement. So what you're trying to focus on is you're trying to push your hips back. So imagine there's a wall behind you and you're trying to touch that wall with your hips. That's what I want you to focus on, rather than focus on lifting the weight. Ultimately, that movement, the RDL movement, the hip hinge will naturally work your erectors, your glutes, your hamstrings, all that sort of stuff. But just from a thought perspective, it's about pushing your hips back and then about pushing them forward. So it becomes this kind of a pendulum. So these are just some of the things that I tend to focus on when I'm doing my RDL. To me, the RDL is a king of exercises. It really, really is an incredible exercise, and it should be incorporated into your program. If you're trying to make it more of a hamstring biased session, then you can make them stiff leg deadlifts, but the same concept applies. I hope these tips help. If you like the tips, make sure you leave the video a like. It helps me massively, especially channels like myself, which are just starting out. If you've got any other tips that you want about other exercises, then do leave them in the comments somewhere down below as well. Make sure you subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.